My wife Lily and I had been planning a weekend getaway for months, a chance to escape the routine and enjoy some time together along the scenic coast of Northern California. We'd booked a cozy cabin near Mendocino, nestled in the redwoods, and the drive from San Francisco was supposed to be one of those romantic road trips, winding along the Pacific Coast Highway with views of the ocean stretching out into the distance. We left in the late afternoon, hoping to catch the sunset as we made our way north on Highway 101, but, as luck would have it, the weather had other plans. By the time we were an hour into the drive, dark clouds had swallowed up the sky, and a steady drizzle had turned into a full-blown rainstorm. The sunset was hidden behind layers of thick grey clouds, and visibility was quickly becoming an issue. "You think we should stop for a bit?" Lily asked, peering out the passenger window as the rain hammered down, making it hard to see the road ahead. Her voice was calm, but I could tell she was a little uneasy. The narrow coastal roads are tricky on the best of days, and in this weather they felt downright treacherous. I shook my head. "We're only about an hour from the cabin," I said, more to reassure myself than her. "Let's push through. It'll be nice to get there and settle in." She nodded, but the atmosphere in the car felt heavy. The rain was relentless, cascading down in sheets that the wipers could barely keep up with. The road was empty too. I kept expecting to see another car, some headlights coming the other way, but it was just us, alone in the downpour. We took the exit for Highway 20, a stretch that cut through thick forests, winding its way toward Mendocino. The trees loomed on either side, their branches bending under the weight of the rain, and the road twisted and turned like something out of an old horror movie. As we drove deeper into the forest, it felt like the storm had swallowed us whole, cutting us off from everything outside. About 15 minutes later, we saw flashing hazard lights up ahead. I slowed down, squinting through the rain to make out what was causing the holdup. It was a police car, parked diagonally across the road, blocking the lane entirely. An officer stepped out, waving his flashlight toward us. I rolled down the window, letting in the cold, wet air as he approached. He was a tall man with a raincoat pulled tightly around him, his face partially obscured by the hood. "Evening, officer," I said, trying to sound casual. He nodded. "Evening. Sorry, but the road's washed out about 5 miles up. Storm caused a landslide and it's going to take a while to clear. You'll need to take a detour." His voice was steady but tired, like he'd been out in the rain for hours. Lily glanced at me, concerned. "Is there another way to get to Mendocino?" she asked. The officer pointed back down the road. "You'll need to go south a few miles and take Old Ridge Road. It'll get you back on the main highway eventually, but be careful, it's not well maintained, especially in weather like this." We thanked him, and I turned the car around, heading back to find the detour. Neither of us said much as we retraced our route. The rain was still pouring, and every now and then a gust of wind would shake the trees, making it feel like they might topple over at any moment. After a few miles, we found Old Ridge Road, marked by a rusty, barely visible sign. The road was narrow, more like a dirt path than an actual road, and it wound steeply up the hillside, with sharp turns and steep drop-offs that vanished into darkness. I could feel Lily's hand tighten around the seat, her fingers tense as she looked out into the blackness. "Are you sure this is safe?" she asked, her voice low. I hesitated, gripping the wheel tightly. "We don't have much choice. I'll go slow." As we climbed higher, the rain began to ease, but the fog rolled in thick and heavy, swallowing the road ahead. I had to lean forward, practically pressing my nose to the windshield just to make out the faint, winding path. The headlights barely penetrated the fog, casting an eerie glow that made the trees look like shadowy, twisted shapes looming out of the mist. We'd been driving for about 20 minutes when Lily suddenly tensed, her hand gripping my arm. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her eyes wide. "See what?" I asked, my heart pounding. "There was. I thought I saw someone standing by the side of the road back there," she said, her voice shaky. A woman, just standing there in the dark. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing behind us, just the thick, swirling fog. "It's probably just a trick of the light," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "The fog can make things look weird." She nodded slowly, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. I wasn't either, to be honest. Something about this road felt wrong, like we'd wandered onto a path we weren't supposed to take. We continued in tense silence, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the faint patter of rain on the roof. The fog was so dense now that I could barely see the road, and I had to keep the speed low, inching forward around each curve. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something in the fog, a shadow, a flash of movement, but it always vanished before I could make sense of it. Then, as we rounded a particularly sharp bend, we saw it. A car, parked on the side of the road, half hidden by the fog. The headlights were off and the doors were open, swinging gently in the breeze. It was an old model, something from the 90s, and the paint was faded and chipped, as if it had been there for a long time. "Should we stop?" Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the gear shift. Something about the scene felt wrong, like a trap waiting to be sprung. But what if someone needed help? "I'll check it out," I said, swallowing hard. "Stay in the car, okay?" I stepped out, pulling my jacket tighter as I approached the abandoned vehicle. The air was cold and thick with the smell of wet earth and pine. I shone my flashlight inside the car, and my stomach twisted at what I saw. The seats were covered in mud and leaves, and there was a faint smear of something dark on the dashboard. A single shoe lay on the floor, caked in mud, and the keys were still in the ignition, swinging slightly as if someone had left in a hurry. I backed away, my heart pounding, and hurried back to our car. "Let's go," I said, my voice shaking. "What did you see?" Lily asked, her eyes wide with fear. "Nothing." "No one's there," I lied, not wanting to scare her more than she already was. We drove on, the road seeming to stretch endlessly through the fog. Every now and then, I'd glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road behind us, but it was always empty. After what felt like hours, we finally saw the faint glow of lights up ahead. We'd made it back to the main highway. Relief washed over me, and I let out a long breath, gripping Lily's hand. But just as we turned onto the highway, something made me glance at the rearview mirror one last time. And that's when I saw her. A woman standing on the side of the road, her long hair matted with rain, her face pale and expressionless. She was watching us, her eyes fixed on our car as we drove away. Her clothes were soaked and torn, and she held a single shoe in her hand, the same shoe I'd seen in the abandoned car. I didn't say anything to Lily, I just kept driving, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel, refusing to look back. The lights of Mendocino were a welcome sight, but even as we reached the safety of our cabin, I couldn't shake the image of the woman standing alone in the rain, watching us disappear into the night. Last fall, I decided to take a solo road trip along Route 66. It was something I'd dreamed of doing for years. Just me, the open road, and some time to clear my head. I'd always been drawn to the history of the road, with its motels, diners and towns that seemed frozen in time. Starting in Chicago, I planned to drive all the way to Santa Monica, taking my time and stopping wherever I felt like it. Everything was smooth for the first few days. I stayed in some quirky motels, ate at small diners where the waitresses called me Hon, and drove through stretches of the desert that felt like I was the only person left in the world. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. By the time I reached New Mexico, the sky had turned grey, and the forecast was warning of thunderstorms. I had planned to stop in Gallup for the night, but the weather was holding steady, just light rain, so I decided to push on to Albuquerque. It was a long stretch, about 140 miles, but I figured I could make it there by late evening. As I drove down the nearly empty highway, the rain picked up, turning into a steady downpour. The lights of Gallup faded in my rearview mirror, leaving me alone on the dark, wet road. The rhythmic sound of the rain against the windshield was oddly soothing at first, but as the miles ticked by, I started to feel uneasy. The road was emptier than I'd expected. No other cars, not even trucks. And something about the darkness pressing in on me felt heavier, more isolating than it had before. About 20 miles out of Gallup, I saw a figure standing on the shoulder of the road. It was a woman, alone, her arms stretched out in a desperate attempt to flag me down. She was drenched, her dark hair plastered to her face, and she wore what looked like a long coat that clung to her from the rain. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. Part of me thought it was a bad idea to pick up a stranger in the middle of the night, especially in weather like this, but she looked desperate. I pulled over, rolling down my window just enough to ask if she needed help. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think anyone would stop. I unlocked the passenger door and she climbed in, shivering as she settled into the seat. She looked like she was in her late 20s, maybe early 30s, with a thin, haunted face and a trembling smile. "I was headed to Albuquerque," she said, her voice wavering. "My car broke down a few miles back and I've been out here for hours." I nodded, glancing at her soaked clothes. "You're lucky I came along. This road is deserted tonight." She nodded, staring out at the rain with a far-off expression, like she was somewhere else entirely. I tried to make small talk, asking where she was from and what brought her out here, but her answers were short, almost evasive. I didn't press her, figuring she was just shaken from being stranded in the rain. After about 15 minutes of driving in silence, I noticed her glancing nervously over her shoulder, as if she expected to see something, or someone, following us. The rain was coming down harder now, a heavy sheet of water that made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I gripped the wheel tighter, feeling the tension building in the car. "Are you okay?" I asked, glancing over at her. She nodded quickly, but her eyes stayed fixed on the road behind us. "There was someone on the road back there," she said finally, her voice barely audible over the rain. "When my car broke down, I thought I was alone, but I kept hearing footsteps, like someone was walking in the rain just out of sight." A chill ran down my spine, and I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone behind us. But the road was empty, swallowed by the darkness. "Did you see anyone?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She shook her head. "No, but I could feel them, like they were watching me, waiting for me to move." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, trying to focus on the road. But her words lingered, gnawing at me. Every time I glanced in the mirror, I felt a strange urge to look closer, to make sure no one was following us. About an hour later, as we approached the outskirts of Albuquerque, the rain began to ease, turning into a light drizzle. The woman relaxed a little, letting out a shaky breath, and I felt the tension in the car lift slightly. "Thank you for stopping," she said, her voice softer now. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't." "No problem," I replied, trying to sound casual. "I'm just glad I could help." As we entered the city, I offered to drop her off at a nearby gas station. She thanked me again, her smile still faint and sad. As she got out of the car, she leaned back in and handed me a small piece of paper folded into a tight square. "If you ever need help, if you ever feel like you're not alone on the road, read this," she said, her eyes meeting mine with a strange intensity. Before I could ask her what she meant, she closed the door and disappeared into the shadows of the gas station. I didn't look at the paper right away. I tucked it into my glove compartment and tried to shake off the eerie feeling from our conversation. But as I continued my drive through New Mexico over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about her, about the fear in her eyes and the footsteps she'd heard in the rain. On the last night of my trip, I was driving through a deserted stretch of highway with no towns or lights in sight, when I started to feel off. The road was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me, just beyond the edge of my headlights. I opened the glove compartment, pulling out the folded piece of paper she'd given me. My hands were shaking as I unfolded it, and when I saw what was written inside, my blood ran cold. It was a simple message, scrawled in dark ink. "Don't look back." My heart pounded as I gripped the steering wheel, forcing myself to keep my eyes on the road ahead. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, like someone was sitting in the back seat, leaning closer, their breath warm against my neck. I drove faster, refusing to glance in the mirror, my eyes locked on the faint line of the horizon. The feeling of presence was so overwhelming, so suffocating, that I almost couldn't breathe. Every instinct was screaming at me to turn around, to look and see who or what was behind me. But I didn't. I kept my eyes forward, clutching that piece of paper like it was a lifeline. After what felt like an eternity, the feeling faded, and the road was empty once more. I glanced down at the note and saw that it had smudged from the dampness of my hands, the ink fading, almost as if it had never been there. When I finally reached my destination, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. But the memory of that night stayed with me. I never saw the woman again, never learned who or what had been on that road with her, waiting in the rain. But now, whenever I drive at night and the road feels too quiet, too empty, I keep my eyes forward. And I never, ever look back. One summer night a few years back, my friends and I decided to take a spontaneous road trip. There were 3 of us, me, James, and our friend Andy. We'd been close since high school, and every now and then we'd do something impulsive, like hit the road with no real destination in mind, just to feel like we were escaping the routines of life. That night, we set our sights on Willow Lake, a remote spot a few hours north of Portland, Oregon, known for its quiet, still waters and dense, towering forests. We left late in the day, planning to get to the lake around midnight, just in time to set up camp and maybe do some night fishing. I was driving. James was in the passenger seat with the maps. He always preferred paper maps over GPS. And Andy was sprawled out in the back seat, munching on a bag of chips and cracking jokes. The drive started off great. The sky was clear, the air warm, and the roads empty. But as we got further out of the city, the weather began to change. Dark clouds rolled in, swallowing up the stars, and soon enough, rain started to fall. Just a light drizzle at first, but then it became heavier, turning into a steady downpour that made it hard to see the road ahead. "Man, I don't remember it ever raining this hard in July," James muttered, squinting through the windshield. The wipers were working overtime, but they could barely keep up with the sheets of rain. "Should we just find a place to crash for the night?" I asked, gripping the wheel tighter as the car shuddered over the wet road. "Nah," Andy chimed in from the back. "We're so close. Just take that shortcut through the old road by Willow Lake. We'll be there in no time." James nodded, glancing down at the map. "Yeah, if we take this turnoff up here, it'll cut the drive by at least half an hour." Against my better judgment, I took the exit onto a narrow, winding road that led toward the lake. The road was lined with thick trees, their branches heavy with rain, and it felt like we were driving deeper into a tunnel of darkness with every mile. The headlights barely cut through the mist, and the road was so slick that every turn felt like a gamble. We drove in silence for a while, the rain drumming against the roof, when suddenly Andy let out a quiet whistle from the back seat. "Hey, did you see that?" he asked, leaning forward. "See what?" I asked, not taking my eyes off the road. "I swear I saw someone standing on the side of the road back there. Looked like they were waving," he said, sounding more curious than concerned. James and I exchanged a glance. There was no reason anyone would be out here in this weather, especially at this hour. Probably just your mind playing tricks, I said, trying to brush it off. But even as I said it, I felt a strange chill. The rain was pouring harder now, and the road felt like it was stretching on forever, winding endlessly through the dark forest. Then, we saw it. Up ahead, just visible in the glare of the headlights, was a figure. A woman, standing on the edge of the road. She was soaked, her long hair hanging in wet strands over her face, and she wore what looked like an old-fashioned dress that clung to her from the rain. She was waving at us, her hand moving in slow, almost robotic gestures like she was trying to get our attention. "Didn't Andy just say?" James muttered, staring at her as we approached. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to pull over, coming to a stop a few feet away. The rain was pounding so hard it was almost impossible to see clearly, but there she was, standing just outside the reach of the headlights, her eyes fixed on us. "Maybe she needs help," Andy suggested, sounding less certain than before. "I'll roll down the window and ask," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. As I rolled down the window, the cold, wet air filled the car, and I leaned out, squinting through the rain. "Are you okay? Do you need a ride?" She didn't respond, just stood there, staring. Her eyes were dark and hollow, and there was something off about her expression, like she was more shadow than person. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was studying us like we were the ones who were out of place. James leaned over, whispering, "Dude, I don't like this. Let's just go." I nodded, rolling up the window and easing back onto the road. As we pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her still standing there. But she was gone, swallowed by the rain and darkness. We drove in silence for a few minutes, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I could feel the tension in the car, like we were all holding our breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, out of nowhere, Andy let out a strangled gasp. "She's up ahead again," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. Sure enough, as we rounded a bend, there she was, standing in the exact same spot, her hand raised in that slow, deliberate wave. My heart skipped a beat, and I gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. "How did she?" James stammered, his face pale. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we had to get out of there. I pressed down on the accelerator, speeding up as the road twisted and turned. The rain was coming down in torrents now, and the trees seemed to close in around us like they were trying to trap us on that road. But no matter how fast we drove, she kept appearing, around every curve, standing on the side of the road, her hollow eyes following us. It was like she was taunting us, daring us to stop. Finally, we saw a break in the trees up ahead. The road widened, and the lights of a gas station appeared in the distance, a small oasis of warmth and light. I didn't even hesitate. I pulled into the parking lot, skidding to a stop as we all tumbled out of the car, desperate for solid ground. The gas station attendant looked up, raising an eyebrow as we stumbled in, dripping wet and visibly shaken. He was an older man with a grizzled beard and a weathered face that seemed to have seen its share of strange things. "Y'all look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a chuckle. James, still catching his breath, managed to stammer, We saw someone. A woman. She kept appearing on the road, every time we turned." The man's expression darkened, and he glanced out the window, as if he knew exactly what we were talking about. "You boys took Old Willow Road, didn't you?" he asked quietly. We nodded, not daring to say anything. The man sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. "That road, locals call it the Widow's Walk. There's a story about a woman who lost her husband in a logging accident back in the 1920s. She went mad with grief, wandering the forest every night, hoping to find him. People say she walks that road, looking for lost souls to join her." A cold silence settled over us, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. The man nodded toward our car. "Best to stay on the main roads from here on out. She doesn't usually let people leave once she finds them." We left the gas station without saying another word, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The rain had stopped, and the night was eerily quiet as we made our way back to the highway, finally reaching Willow Lake just before dawn. But even as the sun came up, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly left her behind. To this day, none of us talk about that night, but every time I drive through that area, I feel her presence, just beyond the reach of the headlights, waiting on the side of the road.